The Chemical Marriage and the Invention of the Metaphysical Conceit in William Alabaster's Divine Meditations by Eric Diamond. Wit, abstracted from its effects upon the hearer, may be more rigorously and philosophically considered as a kind of discordia concors, a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. So begins Samuel Johnson's famous definition of metaphysical poetry. The critical tradition after Johnson has disagreed about much, but what has remained constant is the understanding that metaphysical poetry is synonymous with poetry that deploys the conceit. As Helen Gardner has noted, these metaphysical conceits, as comparisons whose ingenuity is more striking than their justness, are designed to make us concede likeness while being strongly conscious of unlikeness. For Johnson and Gardner, as for a later generation of critics, the definition of metaphysical poetry depends upon this union of opposites, this yoking together by violence of heterogeneous ideas. Still, what has yet been written on metaphysical poetry has concentrated more on attempts to define the form rather than on developing an understanding of its historical origins. In order to more fully understand the factors which led to the development of the metaphysical conceit in English letters, we intend to examine the sonnets of an often forgotten English poet of the late 16th century, William Alabaster. Though regularly neglected in critical appraisals of the period, Alabaster's work was routinely lauded by some of his most esteemed contemporaries. Robert Herrick called him the one only glory of a million, in whom the spirit of the gods doth dwell. In his biography, The Worthies of England, Thomas Fuller proclaimed Alabaster as the most rare poet as any our age or nation hath produced. Even from the very beginning of his poetic career, when he had only just published the first book of his unfinished epic poem, Elaesis, Edmund Spenser proclaimed him thoroughly taught in the art of poetry, though known yet to few. In spite of this high praise, almost no work has been published on Alabaster in the past 50 years, and even the older generation of critics who had written on his work did not seem entirely sure of his place in literary history. Helen Gardner and J.M. Story, the critics who published the first scholarly edition of the Divine Meditations in 1959, noted rather cheekily that the piety is more obvious than the poetry, and that the chief cause of the poor quality of many of the Divine Meditations is Alabaster's limited poetic talent. For Gardner and Story, to discuss some of the more obscure passages of Alabaster's work would be to waste criticism upon unresisting imbecility, citing that the only important source for his sonnets are the scriptures and the traditional interpretations of them. However, in ignoring Alabaster's more obscure verses, Gardner and Story have prejudiced an entire generation of scholars to his work. In their assumption that Alabaster limited himself to scriptural sources, Gardner and Story have ignored the fundamental role that alchemy played in Anglo-Catholic verse during the early 16th century. We argue that a careful look at Alabaster's work from an alchemical lens allows us to make light of the obscure passages of his verse. Here, rather than unresisting imbecility, we instead find a treasure trove of poetic wit, presenting us with a much different portrait of the poet and his place in English literary history than an earlier generation of critics would have had us imagine. We propose that Alabaster's investment in alchemy, particularly in his use of the central organizing principle of the chemical marriage, lead to his most significant and lasting contribution, namely, his invention of the characteristic and often discussed metaphysical conceit. For Alabaster, the use of the conceit is a means of allegory, by which the union of opposites that is performed in the alchemical opus is performed on a formal level within the text of the sonnet, by means of paradox. In looking at the often strange way in which Alabaster uses the language of alchemy to make sense of his Catholic faith, we propose that Alabaster's sonnets are important texts for helping us understand the origins of metaphysical poetry more broadly. It is in Alabaster that the earlier poetic use of alchemy, such as that seen in the poetry of St. Robert Southwell, becomes tied with the project of a union of opposites in the level of form. It is this innovation that establishes his work as a key link in our understanding of later metaphysical poets, such as Crashaw, Donne, Herbert, and Marvell, whose use of the metaphysical conceit is also tied in with Catholic or alchemical valences. Alabaster makes explicit use of alchemical discourse throughout the Divine Meditations, but Sonnet 26 in particular provides us with a useful starting point for our efforts. in that the alchemical metaphor used here is both grounded in Catholic thought, even as it remains resolutely metaphysical. The subject is Christ crowning with thorns. The opening 8 lines imagine the fall of man as a sort of botanical descent, by which men, as cedars stately tall, become the thorns by which Christ must be afflicted before his crucifixion. The devotional content of these lines is relatively standard, but the real innovation picks up when we reach the Volta, providing us with a solid entry point into Alabaster's union of alchemical imagery and Catholic thought. He proceeds, "For with the purple tincture of his blood, which out the furrows of his brows did rain, he hath transformed us thorns from baser wood, to raise our nature in odious strain, that we, who with our thorny sins did wound him, hereafter should with rosial virtues crown him." Purple tincture is the key alchemical term here. As Lindy Abraham writes in her Dictionary of Alchemical Imagery, it is the same as the red elixir or stone. The Latin purpureus means purple-colored, dark red, dark brown. The red stone or elixir, which can tinge all base metals to gold and restore man to perfect health and consciousness of God, is frequently described as the precious purple tincture. The resonance here is that Alabaster sees the blood of Christ as being in some sense the real purple tincture. Much as the purple tincture of the alchemical opus has the ability to turn base metals into gold, so too does the purple tincture of Christ's blood have the ability to transform us thorns from baser wood and raise our nature in odious strain, bringing us to this specified state of spiritual health and divine consciousness. In an alchemical context, the production of this purple tincture occurs in the reddening of the white stone, the final stage of the alchemical opus, which is known as the rubido. This is the last stage of the work before the production of the philosopher's stone has been completed. As Abraham notes, it is also known as the rubification, the reddening of the white matter of the stone at the final stage of the opus alchemicum, the attainment of the philosopher's stone, the attainment of the consciousness of God, and the goal of the opus. If Alabaster is consistent in using alchemical imagery, we must then ask, if a purple tincture finds itself accompanied by a white stone, then where is the white stone to be found in Sonnet 26? Though perhaps the pun is somewhat amateurish, here we find that the white stone is none other than the poet Alabaster himself. As described in Lindy Abraham's Alchemical Dictionary, alabaster was one symbol of the white stone of the philosophers, attained at the albedo. Thus Edward Kelly, a 16th century alchemist whose work was roughly contemporaneous with Alabaster's own, would go on to say that, as the mercury becomes white, our white sulfur becomes incombustible, containing the poison, whose whiteness is like the whiteness of alabaster. Thus here we see the poet Alabaster as the white stone, undergoing a reddening or rubification by contact with the purple tincture of Christ's holy blood. This is but one of Alabaster's alchemical means of describing the function of the Eucharist. Though we do not have sufficient length here to show the often kaleidoscopic ways Alabaster develops his alchemical understanding of Catholicism, we do hope to show how this particular description of the Eucharist is developed in other sections of the Divine Meditations. In this regard, Sonnet 30, which has Alabaster prostrate at the scene of the crucifixion, is a suitable choice. Before thy cross, O Christ, I do present my soul and body unto love distilled, as dewy clouds with equal moisture filled, receive the tincture of the rainbow bent, and print those wounds which did thy feet torment, on my affections, which to thee I yield. We must again begin by seeking to define terms. Distillation is the key word here. As Abraham writes, in distillation, the dead united body of the lovers, that is, the two conflicting forces in the alchemical marriage, is said to exude sweat and tears as it is distilled in the alembic and cleansed of its impurities. During the distillation, the alembic too is said to weep, as the droplets of moisture condense at the top of the still and fall down upon the blackened body below. To clarify, here Lindy uses the word lovers, as it was often used in alchemical discourse, to describe the mercury and sulfur which were to be united to begin the process of putrefaction, known as the nigredo. During this stage, the body and soul of the pair of lovers are said to be separated before they can be purified. Abraham explains that, when the old body, or the metal or matter of the stone, has been dissolved and lies putrefying at the bottom of the alembic, the soul is released, and the spirit rises as a volatile vapor to the top of the vessel, where it condenses and descends as rain, dew, or tears from heaven onto the dead body below. The as of the third line of Alabaster's sonnet gives us the simile. by which we may understand the distillation process described in the first two lines. It is like wet clouds becoming rainbows. This is a careful allusion to the peacock's tail, a sort of sub-stage in the alchemical work which immediately precedes the production of the white stone. Quoting Abraham again, "When the blackness of the Negretto is washed away, it is succeeded by the appearance of all the colors of the rainbow, which look like a peacock displaying its luminous tail." Thus Alabaster sees the production of himself, the literal white stone of the opus, as the distillation of his body and soul, which have received the tincture of the rainbow bent, here referring to the manifold ways in which Christ imprints his wounds onto the unified body and soul of the speaker. Thus, the putrid body and soul of Alabaster become really and truly alabaster when they come into contact with the sufferings of Christ, reaffirming the dictum of St. Irenaeus, that the glory of God is man fully alive. Thus the sufferings of Christ act as an ablution, a distillation by which the base soul and body of Alabaster, that is to say, the product of the Negretto, can become what he was really and truly meant to be, the white stone of the opus. Purified by these sufferings, Alabaster becomes more fully himself, just as in the alchemical work the alabaster of the white stone is formed by means of this distillation. Sonnets 26 and 30 are not the only places where the blood of Christ is given such a transformative quality. The description of Christ in Alabaster's Sonnet 58 mirrors an earlier portrayal by St. Robert Southwell in St. Peter's Complaint. As critic Gary Kuchar describes Southwell's interpretation, the four elements are brought together symbolically in Christ's eyes, producing a compound, or tincture, that helps replenish St. Peter. The analogous alchemical image is found in Alabaster, where we discover that within the sacred breast of Christ is entabled the sum of nature's digest, where all may learn a brief introductory, for there is fire, air, water, earth refined. By the alchemical reckoning, the refining of the four natural elements produced in the chemical marriage forms the quintessence, or purple tincture, which may heal us and transform the poet Alabaster, as if by rubedo, and bring us to the knowledge and consciousness of God. A similar means of describing the Eucharist is seen in Sonnet 31. "Behold a conduit that from heaven doth run, and at Christ's side a double stream doth vent. Water with blood, and blood with water went, water of solace and blood of passion. All faithful souls must drink this potion, where pain to passion is ingredient. Comfort not made to cause the pain relent, but pain to relish contentation." Here Alabaster presents us with another chemical marriage, or union of opposites, this time between the solace of water and the passion of blood. The mixing of water and blood is essential to both the biblical narrative of Christ's crucifixion, as well as to the Catholic liturgy. The Council of Trent anathematized anyone who affirmed that water ought not to be mixed with the wine that is to be offered in the chalice, while St. Thomas Aquinas earlier defended the practice on the ground that the mixing of water and wine represented the union of the two natures of Christ, who is at once both fully human and fully divine. It is this chemical union between the human and divine natures which metaphorically produces the purple tincture, described as the potion which all faithful souls must drink, namely, the liturgically produced blood of Christ, present in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. The trope of the chemical marriage is not limited to Alabaster's description of the sacrament either, though the links between his alchemical and Catholic lines of thought are most well illustrated there. From the very beginning of the Divine Meditations, Alabaster makes clear his intent to perform the chemical marriage in verse. The first sonnet thus functions as a sort of introductory text by which he describes his goals for the sonnet sequence as a whole. Here, in Sonnet 1, Christ is portrayed as a warrior figure, whose fiery contemplations are mirrored in the poet's own mind. This occurs when Alabaster makes the attempt to take the portrait of Christ's death in himself, the fruits of which are the sonnets which fill this book. In the poem's closing volta, Alabaster informs us that, his thoughts inflamed with such heavenly muse, the coldest ice of fear may not refuse. Hot thoughts and cold fear. This union of opposites can be seen as the organizing principle of the first sonnet, and of the sonnet sequence more generally. Alabaster's poetic creed is expressed through the marriage of hot and cold, with the contemplations of Christ on a macrocosmic level being evident in the microcosm of the poet's own contemplations. A similar, though not yet explicitly alchemical tendency towards contraries, asserts itself elsewhere in the early sonnets. Of moist and dry, rather than of hot and cold, he begs of Christ in Sonnet 4 to rain upon me with a shower of grace, and dry this winter swelling with thy love. Similarly, In Sonnet 16, we hear of the diversity of the poet's tears, which come in three sorts: bitter, brinish, and sweet. The Volta challenges the reader to see a sort of coherence in each species of tears. Despite their different properties, each variety of tears is implicated in the contrariness of the other. Thus Alabaster concludes, "Never did contraries so well agree, for the one without the other will not be." While the productivity of these unions is challenged in the later sonnets, such as in Sonnet 69, it only occurs momentarily. Here Alabaster begins again with warmness and coldness as guiding metaphors. "With heat and cold I feel the spiteful fiend, to work one mischief by two contraries." In this sonnet, the devil is as keen on contraries as Alabaster. "With lust he doth me scorch, and with languor freeze." Yet in spite of this, Alabaster's solution to this danger should be, by now, obvious enough. "Let contraries with contraries contend. Let fear of blame and love of Christ arise. Hot love of Christ to melt in tears mine eyes. Cold fear of just reproach my shame to extend. That shame with heat may cool my looser thought, and tears with cold heart my heart's sluggish deep." As we hope to have illustrated, it is precisely this chemical wedding, or union of opposite forces and substances, that is the calling card of Alabaster's English poetry, and thus an important milestone in the beginning of the metaphysical conceit. The union of the hot, male, and dry philosophical sulfur with the cold, female, and moist philosophical argent vive is a recurring theme throughout Alabaster's sonnets, envisioned both as a means of self-fashioning and of confessional description. In this way, we may now reevaluate Alabaster's deployment of contraries as being not only in line with the developmental arc of the metaphysical tradition, but as also being in an important sense tied to the poet's personal investment in alchemical discourse. The union of hot and cold and of dry and moist serve as a sort of chemical marriage by which the poet sees his spiritual life progressing. It is through the taking of the Eucharist, the real purple tincture of Christ's blood, that the white stone of alabaster may be transformed into something greater, sanctifying the falling and decayed wood of his flesh into the rosial virtues by which Christ is to be crowned. Thus, it is Alabaster's attempts to reckon with the mysteries of the Catholic faith by way of alchemical description that lead him to this witty deploying of contraries. The twin fascinations of Alabaster, both confessional and alchemical, are the driving forces by which the form of the metaphysical conceit takes its shape. The alchemical legacy of Alabaster's sonnets live in the latter, often more recognizably metaphysical work of Donne, Crashaw, Herbert, and Marvell, who deployed alchemical conceits as organizing structures for their own poetry. We propose that a history of the development of metaphysical poetry must take into account both the uniquely Catholic and alchemical roots of this form. In highlighting these qualities in Alabaster's verse, we hope not only to reopen the case of Alabaster to contemporary scholarship, but also to pave the way for future scholarship on the use of the alchemical conceit in metaphysical poetry more broadly.